The Far Quest, The Chronicles of Cursoon, Book 1, by R. Jason Lynch, copyright 2016, EMP 2023, all rights reserved. Chapter 24, Noblins? When Tipple finished playing his fiddle, he laid it aside, quietly slipped into his sleeping sack, and promptly began to snore. With a chuckle, Cursoon shook his head, and then tucked the blanket up under the little old man's bearded chin. It was a fatherly habit that felt more than natural, but when he realized what he was doing, a feeling of despair passed through his heart like a cutting knife. Sighing miserably, Cursoon lay back upon his own bedroll and gazed upward into the limbs above. As he lay there, his thoughts lingered on his 3 sons.
Are they safe?
He wondered, silently. He issued another heavy sigh and then started to close his eyes, but before he could fall asleep, he abruptly jolted up and strained to look into the canopy over his head. For a long moment, he sat very still, watching. In those uncounted seconds, he scarcely dared to breathe. The bard was quite certain that he had caught a glint of light from their campfire in a large pair of eyes. However, after staring for a long time and seeing nothing, he slowly decided that it had been a trick played on him by his own way-weary mind. Thus, he settled back upon his bed and slowly drifted off to sleep. When they were sure neither of the men were awake, the glowing eyes opened. Quietly, tiny figures came down out of the trees and moved out of the shadows into the fading light of the campfire. Their small, bare feet made no sounds as they crept between the resting men. Tiny fingers quietly plucked at Tipple's fiddle. Other small hands took up his bow and slid it across its strings. The screech was loud, and it caused Cursoon to stir and then shift uncomfortably upon his bedroll. All the figures froze until the bard's breathing became rhythmic once more. When it seemed safe, the little intruders went about again, touching everything they found. The gnome's round wooden flask was opened, and little noses sniffed. In response to the fermented smell that lingered within, stifled gags were heard, and then the flask was quickly replaced. A tiny finger was dragged through the empty stew pot and tasted. The reaction was a favorable
"Yum!"
and in response, others came and had their own tastes. One took up Tipple's pipe and sniffed at it, which resulted in a muffled sneeze. Then another pair of little hands reached out and caressed Fortuity, Cursoon's family sword. At the same time, whispered words were uttered.
"It's Wit's blade."
Next, the bard's plain weapon was taken up. The nameless sword rang out in the silent night as it was drawn slowly and cautiously from its scabbard. Glowing yellow eyes were reflected in its leaf-shaped blade. With the sword removed from its undecorated wooden sheath, tiny fingers flipped 2 small latches and then carefully opened the scabbard like one would open a small chest. In response, scarcely restrained gasps of awe came in chorus from the little prowlers. Inside the scabbard, there rested a scroll, and many tiny hands reached out to reverently touch the rolled parchment.
"It's the potter's sword,"
they whispered. When Cursoon awoke the next morning, a metallic scraping sound came to his ears. Stiffly sitting up, the bard drowsily gazed over to find Tipple only yards away, busily working upon a mostly completed boat amid scattered piles of curled wood shavings. The gnome had felled a second larger tree and was actively carving its trunk into a small boat. Like the torch rack, the little musical bridge, the house under the massive old pine, and even the beautiful-sounding fiddle, the boat seemed grown rather than carved. Already, it looked like a giant leaf with its sides curved upwards. After gazing with amazement at the half-carved boat, Cursoon rubbed his eyes, yawned loudly, thought of tea, and then felt for his bag. However, his seeking hand found nothing. Glancing around the campsite, he quickly discovered that everything was in disarray. It was obvious that every object had been moved in the night. Odder still, his plain sword was unsheathed and laid upon a large stone near the lake's edge. And strangest of all, The plain sword scabbard was open like a chest, and within there was an ancient-looking scroll. Kyorsoon did not even know that the scabbard could be opened, or much less, that it held a parchment. Carefully, he took the scroll and unrolled it enough to see what it was. As he did so, he marveled at the parchment's suppleness. To his glad surprise, he discovered that the scroll was actually two, one rolled up within the other. At the top of the first was written, "The Epic of Batalis," and the one inside it bore the title, "The Annals of Eversave." The bard looked over at Tippleglee.
Didn't you serve Sir Beset for many years?
That I did.
The gnome replied grumpily without looking up from his tool as it scraped free another curling strip of wood.
Did you know his sword scabbard held these scrolls?
Kyorsoon asked.
Far too busy was I to go snooping about through his things.
The little man growled while pointing his tool at the bard. Kyorsoon ran his fingers over the inked letters.
To think, I've had this treasure within my grasp all this time.
He scoffed at himself, but then a crease suddenly formed upon his brow.
This makes the whole situation even stranger. Someone went through all our things, but they took nothing, not even the most valuable treasure. Who would do this?
And how should I know?
Tippleglee grumbled without pausing his busy hands. Studying the campsite for scattered clues, Kyorsoon stooped and frowned at the ground. As he looked, his blue eyes grew large, and he quickly called to Tippleglee with a slightly frantic tone.
What now?
The little old man growled and flung the tool in his hand down with exasperation. After a deep sigh, Tippleglee marched over to the campfire, took out his pipe, lit it with a burning twig, and took a long draw of smoke. As he went to where the bard stood pointing, he let several dark puffs escape his nostrils.
Look at these small footprints,
Kyorsoon said when the gnome crouched down beside him. Tippleglee adjusted his wood-rimmed spectacles and studied the tiny tracks. Because the pipe was between his teeth, his words came out slightly jumbled and hard to understand.
Hat plains why everhin was scare a out.
The gnome grumbled around the stem of his pipe.
These aren't goblin tracks, are they?
Kyorsoon asked with a note of concern.
Hair Noblin prins.
Tippleglee replied with a shake of his head.
What are Noblins?
The bard almost shouted. The gnome quieted the other man with a growled shush. In response, Kyorsoon glanced around and lowered his voice to a whisper.
What are Noblins?
Rolling his greenish-hazel eyes, Tippleglee took the pipe out of his mouth.
I didn't say Noblins. I said, they're not goblins.
Oh.
The bard sighed with relief.
If they'd been goblins, they'd have slit our throats and stolen everything we own, and that's if we were lucky. No, a goblin's footprint has 2 toes longer than the rest.
Tippleglee added with a smirk, and then jabbed his pipe back into his mouth. After a grimace, a puzzled look grew upon Kyorsoon's face.
All right, then who made these?
The gnome narrowed his brownish-green eyes at the taller man and pulled his pipe out again.
They're nothing to be feared, just a mere nuisance. That's all.
With that, he stomped back to where he had been working on the small boat. Kyorsoon gazed after Tippleglee with a confused expression, but he knew it was a waste of his time to try and pry more out of the grumpy little man. Shaking his head, the bard made himself busy gathering up his belongings, but as he did so, his blue eyes noticed even more small footprints littering the ground throughout their campsite. This made his worry return. Glancing over at the lake, the countless trees looked to him like an army wading out into the water.
What's next? Walking trees?
The bard grumbled to himself as he picked up his family sword.
Here's yet another proof that some of the old songs are wrong. All these years they led me to believe the grayling races were long extinct. This forces me to ask a question I dare not consider. What other vile things lurk in the wild places of the world?
With that idea, the hairs upon the back of his neck stood on end. He had always thought of the world as being mostly tame, but now he was keenly aware of the opposite possibility. Suddenly, his mind jumped to thinking of his wife and young sons.
Did they encounter any of the fell races?
This question made him feel sick.